The iron gates of the Sterling estate did not welcome visitors, they warned them. Standing 12 feet high and crowned with sharp, obsidian spikes, they separated the chaotic pulse of Seattle from a world of terrifying, manicured silence. For Natalie, standing on the wet pavement with a cheap umbrella struggling against the biting wind, those gates looked less like an entrance to a job and more like the mouth of a beast that had swallowed all warmth. She checked her reflection in a puddle, smoothing down the hem of her sensible beige coat. She was 26, with eyes the color of warm honey and a spirit that had been tested by a life of relentless, quiet struggle. Natalie wasn't here because she wanted to serve the elite. She was here because a teaching position she loved had been cut, her savings were gone, and the agency had called this assignment challenging but lucrative. She didn't care about the lucrative part. She cared about survival. But looking at the imposing gray stone mansion looming through the mist, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. The walk up the driveway was a lonely pilgrimage. The gardens were perfect, too perfect. Not a leaf out of place, not a flower daring to bloom out of turn. It was a landscape controlled to the inch, devoid of the messy, beautiful chaos of life. When the heavy oak door finally opened, it wasn't a smiling face that greeted her, but the stern, sharp-featured housekeeper, Mrs. Agatha, who looked at Natalie's worn shoes with immediate disapproval. Inside, the house was a cathedral of echoes. The air smelled of lemon polish, old books, and isolation. There were no family photos on the console tables, no scattered toys, no sound of laughter. Just vast, polished floors that reflected the gray sky from the high windows. It felt less like a home and more like a museum where happiness was a prohibited exhibit. "Mr. Sterling is concluding a conference call," Mrs. Agatha said, her voice dry as parchment. "He does not like to be kept waiting. And he does not like noise. You are here for the child, but you answer to him." Natalie nodded, clutching her bag tighter. She was led into a cavernous library, a room lined with thousands of books that looked like they had never been opened. And there, sitting on a velvet armchair that seemed too big for her, was Mia. The girl was 6 years old, but she had the eyes of an old soul who had seen too much winter. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring at the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass. She didn't look up when Natalie entered. She was a tiny, fragile doll placed on a shelf, forgotten. Natalie's heart broke instantly. She recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had learned that being invisible was safer than being seen. Silence is the loudest cry of a heart locked away. Before Natalie could say a word, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The double doors swung open with a decisive swoosh. Brandon Sterling entered the room. He was a man carved from ice and ambition. Tall, with a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad frame with intimidating precision, he moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned every second of the day. His hair was dark, swept back severely, and his jawline was sharp enough to cut. But it was his eyes, piercing, Arctic blue, that stole the air from Natalie's lungs. They were beautiful, yes, but they were devoid of light. They were the eyes of a man who had looked at the world, found it wanting, and decided to stop feeling anything at all. He didn't look at his daughter. He walked straight to his desk, checking a notification on his watch, treating the room and its inhabitants as variables in an equation he was trying to solve. "Miss Vance, is it?" Brandon's voice was a deep baritone, smooth but utterly detached. He didn't offer a handshake. He stayed behind the barrier of his massive mahogany desk. "My assistant says you have a background in child psychology and education. That's fine, but I don't need a psychologist. I need order." Natalie stepped forward, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the intimidation radiating from him. "I believe children need understanding before they need order, Mr. Sterling." Brandon finally looked up. His gaze locked onto hers, sharp and assessing. For a second, the silence stretched, tense and electric. He wasn't used to being corrected, especially not by the help. He studied her, taking in the frayed cuffs of her coat, the nervous clasp of her hands, and the defiant warmth in her honey eyes. "Mia has gone through 4 nannies in 6 months, Brandon said coldly, walking around the desk to stand in front of her. He towered over her, his presence overwhelming. They all tried to be her friend. They all try to fix this family. They all failed. I pay for competence, Miss Vance, not sentimentality. Can you do the job, or should I call the agency back right now?" Natalie looked past him, to the little girl still staring at the rain, completely ignored by her own father. She saw the tremor in Mia's shoulders. The job was a paycheck, yes, but leaving this child alone in this frozen castle felt like a crime. "I can do the job," Natalie said softly, but with a steel core he hadn't expected. "But I don't do it for the money. I do it for the ones who can't speak for themselves." Brandon narrowed his eyes. For a brief moment, something flickered behind the ice. A flash of surprise, perhaps, or a recognition of a strength he hadn't anticipated. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a warning shot. "Everyone has a price, Miss Vance," he murmured, his scent of expensive cologne and rain filling her senses. "And everyone breaks eventually in this house. Do not think you are the exception." He turned his back on her, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. But as he walked away, Natalie felt the heavy, suffocating truth of a sterling estate settle on her shoulders. She had entered the fortress, but she had no idea that the real danger wasn't the cold man who ran it. It was the possibility that thawing his heart might cost her own. 2 weeks bled into the calendar, gray and unrelenting. The Sterling estate remained a fortress of cold stone and colder silences, but inside the nursery, a subtle rebellion was taking root. Natalie did not fight the darkness with grand gestures. She fought it with small, persistent lights. A drawing pin to the sterile white wall. A muddy pair of rain boots left by the back door. Evidence of a puddle-jumping expedition that Mrs. Agatha had tutored at with pursed lips. The sound of a page turning in a bedtime story, vibrating through the hollow hallways. Natalie navigated the house like a trespasser in a palace, acutely aware of the invisible lines she wasn't supposed to cross. Her world was the nursery, and the small, utilitarian bedroom she had been assigned next to it. Brandon Sterling's world was the rest of the universe, the glass-walled office, the chauffeured cars, the late-night conference calls that drifted through the floorboards like the low hum of a machine that never slept. They were 2 planets sharing the same orbit, destined to collide but kept apart by the gravity of class and duty. He watched her. She felt it before she saw it. It started with fleeting glances. Brandon would pause at the top of the grand staircase as Natalie led Mia to the kitchen for breakfast, his hand hovering over the mahogany banister, his arctic blue eyes tracking their movement. He never spoke, never descended to join them. He simply observed, like a scientist studying a variable that refused to fit into his calculations. He saw the way Mia, who hadn't spoken a full sentence to him in months, now whispered secrets into Natalie's ear. He saw the color returning to his daughter's pale cheeks, a direct contrast to the monochrome existence he had curated. The highest walls are the ones we build around ourselves. One Tuesday evening, the distance between their worlds suddenly collapsed. It was past midnight. A violent storm had knocked out the estate's internet, silencing the constant stream of data that Brandon used to drown out his thoughts. Natalie was in the kitchen, unable to sleep, brewing a cup of chamomile tea. The house was dark, the only light coming from the lightning flashing against the oversized windows. She turned from the stove and gasped. Brandon was sitting at the kitchen island, a glass of amber scotch in his hand, looking like a fallen king in the shadows. He had discarded his suit jacket. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms that looked tense, as if ready for a fight that wasn't happening. "I didn't mean to intrude, Mr. Sterling," Natalie stammered, clutching her mug, suddenly conscious of her worn cotton pajamas and the messy bun in her hair. "I thought everyone was asleep." "Sleep is a luxury I cannot afford," Brandon replied, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it, stripped of its corporate polish. He swirled the liquid in his glass, not looking at her. "And you? Is the silence of this house too loud for you yet?" "It's not the silence that keeps me awake," Natalie said, her courage surprising her. She took a step closer, drawn into his orbit against her better judgment. "It's the sadness. It hangs in the hallways like fog." Brandon finally looked at her. In the dim light of the lightning, the harsh lines of his face seemed softer, younger, but infinitely more tired. He looked at her not as an employee, but as a woman standing in his kitchen, offering warmth in a room designed for utility. The air between them shifted, thickening with a sudden, suffocating tension. It was wrong. He was the billionaire CEO, she was the hired help. But in the dark, those titles felt flimsy, washing away under the raw weight of human exhaustion. "You are changing things," Brandon said low, an accusation that sounded dangerously like a confession. "Mia laughed today. I heard it from my office. I haven't heard that sound since." He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging heavy with grief. "Since before," Natalie offered gently, stepping into the forbidden territory of his past. "Since the winter set in," he corrected cryptically, his eyes locking onto hers. He stood up, abandoning his drink. He moved toward her, slow and predatory, stopping only when he was close enough that she could smell the whiskey and the rain on his skin. The proximity was dizzying. Natalie held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He was too close. This was dangerous. This was the moment the agency warned about, the moment where boundaries blurred. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air near her face. For a terrifying, beautiful second, Natalie thought he might touch her cheek, might bridge the chasm between them. Her skin tingled in anticipation, a magnetic pull that defied logic. She saw the conflict raging in his eyes, the desire to feel something, warring with the terrifying resolve to remain numb. "You can own the sky, but you cannot buy the light." "You offer warmth freely, Miss Vance," Brandon whispered, his voice vibrating in her chest. "But you have no idea what the cold can do to a fire. It doesn't feed it. It extinguishes it." He dropped his hand, the moment shattering like glass. He stepped back, the mask of a CEO slamming back into place, cold and impenetrable. "Do not try to save me, Natalie," he warned, using her first name for the first time, making it sound like a curse and a prayer. "I am not a project, and I am not a broken toy you can fix with crayons and patience." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone in the flashing dark. But as he left, Natalie noticed something that made her breath hitch. On the counter, where he had been sitting, lay a small, framed photograph he must have brought down from the sanctuary of his office. It wasn't a picture of assets or buildings. It was a picture of a woman, beautiful, laughing, holding a baby Mia. But the glass of the frame was cracked, a spiderweb fracture right over the mother's face, as if it had been smashed in a moment of unbearable agony. Brandon wasn't just cold, he was haunted. And for the first time, Natalie realized that the fortress wasn't built to keep people out, it was built to keep the pain in. The obstacle wasn't his arrogance, it was a ghost she couldn't fight. For a fleeting, treacherous week, spring dared to touch the frozen grounds of the Sterling estate. The change wasn't in the weather, the Seattle rain was as persistent as ever, but in the atmosphere that permeated the stone walls. Natalie had managed to do the impossible. She had cracked the door to the fortress, and light was spilling in. It culminated on a Sunday afternoon. Natalie had convinced Mia to bake cookies, a messy, chaotic endeavor that covered the pristine kitchen counter in clouds of flour. Laughter, foreign and bright, echoed through the downstairs halls. It was a sound so pure it stopped Brandon in his tracks as he walked past the open door. He didn't keep walking this time. He stopped. He watched. And then, defying every rule he had set for himself, he stepped inside. When Mia saw him, she didn't freeze as she usually did. Emboldened by Natalie's presence, she held up a misshapen, flour-dusted cookie. "For you, Papa," she whispered. Brandon hesitated. He looked at the cookie, then at Natalie, whose eyes were warm and encouraging, silently daring him to be a father. Slowly, the CEO dissolved. He took the cookie, took a bite, and for the first time in years, a genuine, unguarded smile broke across his face. It was a transformation so profound it made Natalie's breath catch. In that kitchen, surrounded by sugar and mess, they looked like a family. For a terrifying heartbeat, the line between employer and employee vanished, replaced by the magnetic pull of three lonely souls finding an anchor. Happiness is the most dangerous vulnerability of all. But the castle was built on glass, and glass is destined to break. The illusion of domestic peace was shattered the next evening by the arrival of Elena Vance. Elena wasn't family, but she was a fixture in Brandon's world, a high-powered corporate attorney and the daughter of his late wife's business partner. She moved through the estate with the proprietary air of a woman who expected to be the next Mrs. Sterling Not out of love, but out of a merger of empires. Elena saw the change immediately. She saw the way Brandon's eyes lingered on Natalie during dinner service. She saw the softness that had replaced his armor, and she despised it. To Elena, Natalie wasn't a savior. She was a variable that threatened the merger. Late that night, Natalie was summoned to the library. She entered with a light heart, still riding the high of the weekend's connection. She expected a discussion about Mia's schedule. What she found was a tribunal. Brandon stood by the window, his back to her, radiating a coldness that dropped the room's temperature to absolute zero. Elena sat on the edge of his desk, holding a manila folder, a predator smiling at prey. "Close the door, Miss Vance," Brandon said. His voice was dead. The warmth from the kitchen was gone, replaced by the steel of the CEO. "Is something wrong, sir?" Natalie asked, her hands trembling instinctively. Brandon turned slowly. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes were burning with a feeling that looked terrifyingly like betrayal. He didn't speak. He simply nodded at Elena. "We did a standard background refresh," Elena said smoothly, tapping a manicured fingernail on the folder. "It seems you forgot to mention the extent of your motivation for taking this job." She slid a paper across the desk. It wasn't a crime sheet. It was a bank foreclosure notice on Natalie's family home, her parents' home. A desperate, crushing debt that Natalie had been silently carrying, the reason she had taken a high-paying job she was overqualified for. "I didn't steal anything," Natalie whispered, the shame rising in her throat like bile. "I am working to pay it off. My personal finances have nothing to do with my care for Mia." "Don't they?" Brandon's voice cut through the air like a whip. He walked toward her, towering and terrifying. "You stood in my kitchen. You looked me in the eye. You made me believe you cared about my daughter. But you were just securing an asset. You looked at Mia and saw a paycheck large enough to save your house. That isn't true." Natalie cried, stepping forward, desperate to reach the man who had smiled at a cookie just yesterday. "I love her. And I care about you, Brandon." The use of his name was a mistake. Brandon flinched as if struck. The vulnerability he had shown her was now being weaponized by his own paranoia, fed by Elena's poison. He saw himself as a fool who had let a stranger in, only to find out she was just another person wanting something from him. Betrayal is not always an act. Sometimes it is just a misunderstanding fueled by fear. "Care!" Brandon laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You don't care, Natalie. You calculate. You saw a grieving man and a lonely child, and you saw an opportunity. You played the role of the perfect nanny, the perfect healer, all while the meter was running. I am not playing a role." Natalie's tears spilled over, hot and stinging. "I didn't tell you about the debt because I was ashamed, not because I was plotting. The connection we felt, that was real. The only thing real in this world is what you can buy." Brandon spat, retreating behind his desk, rebuilding the wall she had worked so hard to dismantle. "And I am done buying your affection." He didn't fire her. That would have been too simple. Instead, he did something far more cruel. He reinstated the boundaries with brutal precision. "You will finish your contract," Brandon commanded, looking at paperwork, refusing to meet her gaze. "Because Mia needs stability. But you are no longer welcome in the family spaces. You will confine yourself to the nursery and your quarters. You will not speak to me unless it is an emergency. You are an employee, Miss Vance. Nothing more. Do not forget your place again." The dismissal was absolute. Elena smirked from the corner, a victor in a game Natalie didn't know she was playing. Natalie stood there, her heart shattering in her chest. The connection was severed, not by a lack of love, but by a lack of trust. She had reached for him, and he had slapped her hand away because he couldn't believe anyone would hold it without a price tag. She turned and walked out of the library, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with the finality of a coffin closing. The hallway was dark and silent. The warmth was gone. She was back in the fortress, but now it was colder than ever because for a brief, shining moment, she had known what it felt like to be warm. The separation was physical, emotional, and agonizing. She was trapped in the house with the man she loved, who now looked at her and saw only a thief. The days that followed were a suffocating exercise in proximity without connection. Natalie became a ghost in the Sterling mansion, adhering strictly to the invisible boundaries Brandon had drawn. She took her meals in the nursery, she avoided the library, and she averted her eyes when Brandon's car crunched up the gravel driveway at night. But the house itself seemed to rebel against this enforced separation. The air was thick with static, a buildup of unsaid words that pressed against the eardrums. Mia, with the intuitive radar of a child, sensed the fracture. She stopped drawing. The laughter that had briefly filled the kitchen was replaced by a watchful, anxious silence. She looked from Natalie to the closed door of her father's office with a confusion that broke Natalie's heart daily. The breaking point arrived not with a shout, but with a whisper of thunder. A severe storm warning had been issued for Seattle, turning the sky a bruised, ominous purple. By evening, the power grid flickered and died, plunging the estate into absolute darkness. Natalie instinctively reached for her flashlight, her first thought for Mia. She hurried to the child's bed, but the sheets were thrown back, cool to the touch. The bed was empty. "Mia!" Natalie whispered, panic flaring in her chest. She checked the bathroom, the closet. Empty. She ran into the hallway, forgetting the rules, forgetting her place. "Mia!" she called out, louder this time. A door down the hall opened. Brandon appeared, illuminated by the beam of a heavy tactical flashlight. His face was shadowed, his expression hard. "What is this noise?" "I told you." "She's gone," Natalie interrupted, her voice trembling with terror. "Mia isn't in her room. She's terrified of thunder, Brandon. She's hiding." The mask of the CEO vanished instantly, replaced by the raw fear of a father. They didn't speak another word. They moved as a unit, sweeping the darkened house, checking the usual hiding spots. The library, the kitchen, the pantry. Nothing. Fear strips away the lies we tell ourselves to survive. It was Natalie who thought of it. The attic. Mia had mentioned once that she liked the sound of the rain on the roof because it sounded like angels dancing. They rushed up the narrow stairs, Brandon leading the way. The attic was a cavern of dust, sheets, and forgotten furniture, lit only by the strobe light flashes of lightning through the dormer window. And there, tucked into the corner behind an old vanity, was a small, trembling lump under a blanket. Brandon felt at his knees. "Mia!" he breathed, pulling the blanket away. She was curled up, clutching something tightly to her chest. It wasn't a doll. It was the framed photo from the kitchen, the one with the cracked glass over the mother's face. "I didn't want the storm to hurt her," Mia sobbed, holding the picture up. "I wanted to save Mama." The silence that followed was louder than the thunder. Brandon stared at the photo, his face draining of color. He looked at his daughter, trying to save a memory, and then he looked at Natalie, who was kneeling beside him, her hand instinctively resting on Mia's back. He gently took the photo from Mia. "It's okay, sweetheart," he choked out. "You're safe. Natalie is here." He said her name. Not Miss Vance. Natalie. After they settled Mia back into bed, waiting until her breathing deepened into sleep, Brandon didn't dismiss Natalie. He gestured for her to follow him into the hallway. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve. He leaned against the wall, holding the cracked photo loosely in his hand. He looked defeated. "Do you know why this glass is broken?" Brandon asked, his voice hollow. "I assumed an accident," Natalie replied softly. "I threw it," Brandon confessed, the words tearing out of him. "The night she died. My wife, Vanessa. She wasn't a saint, Natalie. She was leaving. The night of the accident. She had packed her bags. She had emptied the joint accounts. She looked at me, with the same warm eyes you have, and told me that she never loved me. She loved the life I provided. She was leaving me for her tennis instructor, and she was planning to take Mia just to spite me." Natalie froze. The revelation shifted the entire axis of the world. Brandon wasn't cruel. He was a survivor of a brutal emotional con. He looked at Natalie and didn't see a woman. He saw the ghost of the betrayal that had destroyed him. "Elena introduced us," Brandon continued, staring at the floor. "Just like she introduced the idea that you were the same. She told me you were drowning in debt, that you were desperate. When I saw the foreclosure notice, it was like watching a rerun of a nightmare. I thought I was protecting Mia from another lie." "I am in debt," Natalie said, her voice shaking but clear. She took a step closer, entering his space, challenging his demons. "But not for clothes, or jewelry, or a lifestyle. My parents lost their business when my father got sick. I took this job to pay for his chemotherapy. I sent every cent of my first paycheck to the bank yesterday. I have $10 in my account, Brandon. If I were a gold digger, I would be terrible at it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, showing him the transaction history. A complete transfer to the bank. Nothing left for herself. I stayed in this house, treated like a criminal, because I love your daughter, Natalie whispered, tears standing in her eyes. And because I hoped that the man who smiled in the kitchen was the real you. I am not Vanessa, and I am not a project you can discard because you are too scared to trust the light. Brandon looked at the phone, then at her face. The evidence was irrefutable. The logic of his fear crumbled against the reality of her sacrifice. He saw her now, not through the lens of his trauma, not through Elena's manipulation, but as she was. A woman who stood in the dark with him, asking for nothing but to be believed. To trust is to walk into the fire hoping you will not burn. He dropped the photo. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. I broke the glass to stop seeing her face, Brandon murmured, stepping closer, his arctic eyes finally melting. But when I look at you, I don't see a lie. I see the only thing that scares me more than betrayal. What is that? Natalie breathed. Hope, Brandon replied. He didn't kiss her. It was too soon. The wounds were too fresh. But he reached out and took her hand, the hand he had rejected days ago. He held it firmly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, a silent apology, a truce, and a terrifying promise all at once. The storm raged outside, but inside the hallway, the war between them had ended. They were standing on the edge of something new, fragile and dangerous. The truth was out, the ghost was named, and now they had to decide if they were brave enough to build something real on the ruins of his past. The dawn that broke over the Sterling estate was not the gray, weeping morning that Seattle usually offered. It was crisp, brilliant, and blindingly bright. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving behind a canvas of piercing blue that mirrored the change within the stone walls of the mansion. Natalie woke up in the armchair in Mia's room, her neck stiff but her heart strangely light. She had stayed there all night, watching the rise and fall of the child's breathing, standing guard against the shadows. When she finally stretched and walked into the hallway, the house felt different. The silence was no longer heavy, it was peaceful. The air didn't smell of old books and isolation anymore. It smelled of coffee and hope. She found Brandon in the kitchen. He wasn't wearing his armor. The charcoal suit was gone, replaced by a soft navy sweater and jeans. He was standing by the window, watching the sunlight hit the wet garden stones. When he turned to face her, the transformation was complete. The Arctic ice in his eyes had thawed, revealing a depth of emotion that was almost overwhelming to witness. Mrs. Agatha is taking the day off, Brandon said softly, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. And Elena has been relieved of her duties. Permanently. Natalie took the mug, her fingers brushing his. The electricity was still there, but it wasn't a warning shock anymore. It was a hum of connection. You fired your attorney. I fire the gatekeeper of my cynicism, Brandon corrected. He leaned against the counter, looking at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. Elena thrived on my distrust. She fed the walls I built because they kept her in power. But last night, seeing you with Mia, seeing the truth on your phone, it tore the blueprint of my life apart. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Natalie tensed instinctively, the memory of the background check still fresh. This is not a severance check, Brandon said quickly, seeing her fear. I made a call this morning. To the oncology department at Seattle, Grace. My foundation funds their research. Your father has been transferred to the private wing. Natalie. The best specialists in the country are taking over his case today. All costs are covered. Indefinitely. Natalie gasped, the mug nearly slipping from her hand. Tears welled up instantly, not tears of shame, but of sheer, crushing relief. The weight she had been carrying for months, the terrifying math of survival, evaporated in a single sentence. Brandon, I can't accept this. It's too much, she stammered. You accepted my daughter when she was broken, Brandon replied, stepping closer, his voice fierce and low. You accepted my anger when I was cruel. You gave us everything you had when you had nothing left for yourself. This isn't charity, Natalie. It's family. And family takes care of each other. The highest walls are the ones we build around ourselves. The phrase echoed in her mind, the leitmotif of their journey, returning to close the circle. Brandon had built the highest walls, topped with glass and ice, believing they kept the pain out. But he had realized, finally, that those same walls had blocked the light. "Where is Mia?" Natalie asked, wiping her eyes. "She's in the garden." Brandon smiled, and it was a true smile reaching his eyes. "She wants to show you the puddles." They walked out together into the crisp morning air. The garden, once a manicured display of control, was now a playground. Mia was stomping in a puddle, her laughter ringing out like a bell, shattering the last remnants of the estate's gloom. When she saw them, she ran over, grabbing both their hands. Natalie's on the left, Brandon's on the right, linking them into a chain of unbroken strength. For a long time, they just stood there, watching the child play. The hierarchy of CEO and nanny had dissolved completely. They were simply a man and a woman who had found each other in the dark. Brandon turned to Natalie, gently releasing Mia's hand to cup Natalie's face. His thumbs brushed away, the last tear tracks on her cheeks. "I told you once that the only thing real in this world is what you can buy," Brandon whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "I was wrong. The only things that matter are the things you cannot buy. Your courage, your patience, this feeling." "And what is this feeling?" Natalie breathed, closing her eyes as she leaned into his touch. "Freedom," Brandon answered. "Freedom from the past. Freedom from the fear that I am unlovable." He kissed her then. It wasn't the desperate kiss of a movie climax, but the slow, deep kiss of a promise kept. It tasted of coffee and morning air, of storms survived and winters ended. In that kiss, the CEO who never believed in love didn't just find a partner, he found his own redemption. The Sterling estate would still have high walls, but they would no longer be a fortress to keep the world out. They would be a garden to keep the love in. As Natalie pulled back, looking into the eyes of the man who had once terrified her, she saw her future reflected in the blue. No longer Arctic, but as warm and open as the summer sky. She had walked into a house of shadows to save a child, but she had ended up saving the king. Love does not just break down walls. It builds a door where there was none, inviting you to step out of the cold and finally come home.